Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This is the application summary lecture. So congratulations, you've done really well. You've got just one more section left and then you'll be able to go ahead and book your exams and hopefully pass on the first attempt. The next section of the course is super fun as well because we're going to do a whole bunch of serverless stuff. So let's have a look at what we learned, and we're going to start with SQS. So SQS is the way to decouple your infrastructure. So we use the example of a meme website or a travel website. Essentially, basically, you store your messages in SQS and your EC2 instances will go get those messages and go ahead and do something. If those EC2 instances, for whatever reason, stop working or are terminated, the message will then reappear in the queue and another EC2 instance will go in and get it. And then that way, if anything fails, it doesn't break your entire application stack. Remember that SQS is pull-based. It's not push-based. If you want push-based messaging, you're going to use SNS. Messages are 256 kilobytes in size. You can actually have them bigger, but it won't be stored in SQS. It'll be stored in S3. And messages can be kept in the queue from 1 minute to 14 days, and the default retention period is 4 days. And then just remember the two different types of SQS. So we've got standard SQS and we've got FIFO SQS, and you have to understand the different use cases for them. So standard order is not guaranteed and messages can be delivered more than once. With FIFO, order is strictly maintained and messages are delivered only once. So really remember that going into your exam. Remember the difference between standard and FIFO. Also remember the visibility timeout. This is the amount of time that the messages is invisible in the SQS queue after a reader picks up that message. Provided the job is processed before the visibility timeout expires, the message will then be deleted from the queue. If the job is not processed within that time, the message will become visible again and another reader will process it. This could result in the same message being delivered twice. So if you are getting the same message being delivered twice and this is the root cause, you may want to increase your visibility timeout just to give your EC2 instances that little bit of extra time to process the message. And just remember that the visibility timeout maximum is 12 hours. Also remember that SQS guarantees your messages will be processed at least once. And then long polling is a way to retrieve messages from your SQS queues, while regular short polling returns immediately, even if the message queue being polled is empty. Long polling doesn't return a response until a message arrives in the message queue or the long poll times out. And this is a way of saving money with SQS. Moving on to SWF, I appreciate we just sort of glazed over it a little bit. Really, you just need to understand SWF versus SQS because you're going to get scenario-based questions and you really want to pick the right one. So SQS has a retention period of 14 days. With SWF, Simple Workflow Service, workflow executions can last up to 1 year. And SWF presents a task-oriented API, whereas SQS offers a message-oriented API. So if you've got a scenario-based questions talking about a task-based structure and maybe it's got human workers, for example, then you want simple workflow. If you're talking about a message-based system, then you're going to go after SQS. SWF ensures that a task is assigned only once and is never duplicated. With SQS, you need to handle duplicated messages if you're using the standard one, if you're not using FIFO. And you may also need to ensure that a message is processed only once. And then SWF keeps track of all tasks and events in an application. With SQS, you need to implement your own application level tracking, especially if your application has multiple queues. Then we learned a little bit about SWF, so Simple Workflow Services actors. So we had workflow starters. These are applications that initiate or start a workflow. Could be your e-commerce website following the placement of an order or a mobile app searching for bus times. Then have our deciders. These basically control activity tasks in the workflow execution. And if something is finished or failed in a workflow, a decider then decides what to do next. And then we have our activity workers, and these are basically people or programs or applications that carry out activity tasks. If you see anything about a human working in a warehouse and you need a way of managing it, then think of Simple Workflow Service. As I mentioned, Amazon.com use Simple Workflow to help run their warehouses. Moving on to SNS, just remember what it is and the different benefits that it gives you. So it's instant push-based delivery. So there's no polling like with SQS. If you want pull-based, you're going to go for SQS. If you want push-based, you're going to go for SNS. It gives you simple APIs and easy integration with applications. You get flexible message delivery over multiple transport protocols. It's inexpensive pay-as-you-go model with no upfront costs. It's a web-based AWS management console, offers the simplicity of a point-and-click interface. And then just like I said, remember SNS versus SQS. They're both messaging services in AWS, but SNS is push, SQS is pull or polls. Your EC2 instances poll the SQS queue. Moving on to Elastic Transcoder, it's really simple. Just remember that it's a media transcoder in the cloud. It converts your media files from their original source format into different formats that will play on smartphones, tablets, PCs, etc. Then API Gateway, I appreciate that this was quite high level. We are going to get our hands dirty with API Gateway in the next section of the course. API Gateway is definitely worth 5 or 10 marks. So just remember what it is at a high level. It's basically a gateway into your AWS resources, your AWS infrastructure. It has caching capabilities to increase performance. It's low cost and scales automatically. That being said, you can throttle API Gateway to prevent attacks, and you can log your results to CloudWatch using API Gateway. And then if you're using JavaScript or Ajax that uses multiple domains with API Gateway, you have to ensure that you have enabled CORS on your API Gateway, so cross-origin resource sharing. And remember that CORS is always enforced by the client's browser. Moving on to Kinesis, just remember the difference between Kinesis Streams and Kinesis Firehose. Kinesis Streams has data persistence. It's going to store your data by default for 24 hours, but can go up to a longer period of time. So you get your data persistence, and then you have your EC2 instances going in and getting the data from the streams. Kinesis Firehose is where you need to analyze your data in real time and then find a place to store it, because there is no persistence. So you could have Lambda functions running in Firehose that then store that data into S3, or they could put it into Elasticsearch clusters, etc., etc. So if you see anything mentioning about shards or about data persistence, you want streams. If you want real-time analytics and then a place to put it instantly with no data persistence, then you're going to be using Firehose. And you're going to be given scenario-based questions where you must choose the most relevant service. And then you have Kinesis Analytics, which basically helps you analyze your data in both Firehose as well as Kinesis Streams. And then finally, we looked at Cognito. So Cognito allows us to do web identity federation. Federation essentially allows users to authenticate with web identity providers such as Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And essentially the way it works is the user authenticates first with the web ID provider and receives an authentication token, which is then exchanged for temporary AWS credentials, allowing them to assume an IAM role. And Cognito is an identity broker which handles the interaction between your applications and the web ID provider, so you don't need to go ahead and write your own code for this. And then the main thing to remember for Cognito is the difference between our user pools. So our user pools are user-based, and they handle things like user registration, authentication, and account recovery, etc., whereas identity pools authorize access to our AWS resources. So that is it for this section of the course. You've done really, really well. In the next section, we're going to go in and learn all about Lambda and serverless architectures, and then we're going to start building some serverless websites. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.